Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, this was originally published in 1936, but I have the novella in this collection called H.P. Lovecraft, The Complete Fiction. Now, The Shadow over Innsmouth is kind of a semi-sequel to H.P. Lovecraft's short story Dagon, which is also a really good story by Lovecraft. Like, this book has a lot of similar ideas to that of the short story Dagon, and also the character of Dagon does have a big part to play in this book. Now, Dagon is actually a god from mythology, I think from Babylonian mythology, but I could be wrong on that, and H.P. Lovecraft took that god from mythology and made him a fictional character in his Cthulhu mythos. Now, The Shadow over Innsmouth is probably the closest that Lovecraft ever came to writing a story about deals with the devil. Now, keep in mind, I still have not yet read every single story by H.P. Lovecraft, but out of all the stories I've read by Lovecraft, this book is probably the closest that Lovecraft ever came to writing a story about a deal with the devil. Now, keep in mind that the demons and devils of H.P. Lovecraft's mythology were not your traditional demons or devils. Like, the demonology of H.P. Lovecraft's universe really did not have a Christian basis to it. It had more of a pseudo-science fiction basis to it when you really stop to think about it, and really the demons and devils and gods of H.P. Lovecraft's universe were really technically aliens when you stop to think about it. Like, they're actually beings from outside our world, from other planets and other galaxies. But that's one of the things that's so interesting about H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, is there's kind of a mixture between science and magic, because the beings of Lovecraft's mythology are technically aliens, yet there is something mystical about them as well. But once again, Lovecraft's mythology really did not have a Christian basis for it, because Lovecraft was an atheist, and you really do get the idea that there is no God in the H.P. Lovecraft universe, and if there is a God in the H.P. Lovecraft universe, then God is completely apathetic towards the human race. Now, there are technically gods in the H.P. Lovecraft universe, like Cthulhu and Dagon and Yog-Sothoth, but basically the whole idea of Lovecraft's mythology is that if gods exist, then they're either completely apathetic towards humanity or they hate humanity, and that to me is one of the most horrifying aspects of H.P. Lovecraft's mythology. And one of the things that strikes me so much about Lovecraft's stories is the pessimism that's in his stories, because basically the whole idea of his mythology is that the human race is really kind of insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and that to me, once again, is one of the most horrifying things about H.P. Lovecraft's stories, not just this story, but his stories in general. Now, the plot of The Shadow over Innsmouth is, it's about this student who is taking a tour of New England, and one day he comes across this exotic piece of jewelry, and he's told that this piece of jewelry originated in a town called Innsmouth. Now, before going to Innsmouth, this young man hears a lot of strange rumors about this town, and he also finds out that the people who live in the towns that neighbor Innsmouth really do not like the residents of this town. But this young man, he goes to the town of Innsmouth with the intention of just staying there for a day, but he immediately does not like this town at all, and he notices that there's something very off about the people in the town, and there's something not right about them, and he notices just this strange, oppressive atmosphere about the town. But this young man, he eventually hears from a drunk in the town that 100 years before the events of this story, the people of this town were facing great hardships, and they eventually made a deal with these ancient gods that predate Christianity, these gods from the sea, and because they made a deal with these gods, basically they got what they wanted, but now the people of the town are physically changing, and even in the beginning of the story, the main character notices something physically not right about the people of this town. But that's all I want to say about the plot. Now, I can honestly say that this is definitely one of the creepiest stories by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, as I said before, I still have not yet read every single story by Lovecraft, but out of the stories that I have read from him, this is definitely one of the creepiest of his stories. Also, there's a particular chase sequence towards the end of this story, and people who have read this novella know exactly what I'm talking about, and it is a really, genuinely scary scene in the book. And also, the last, 2 pages of this story are just creepy as hell. So yeah, I highly recommend The Shadow over Innsmouth if you haven't read this novella yet. And also, this book, for a book that was written in the 1930s, this story is really ahead of its time in a lot of ways, and I would say that about a lot of H.P. Lovecraft stories. Lovecraft's stories were very original and shockingly ahead of their time in a lot of ways. Now, in this book, there are these fish-like creatures, and I would not be surprised if the character of the Gill Man from The Creature from the Black Lagoon was in some way inspired by the fish-like creatures that show up in this story. There was also a 1980 Roger Corman movie called Humanoids from the Deep, and the creatures from that movie were very similar to the fish-like creatures that show up in this book. Now, in the 90s, there was a Japanese movie made which was based on this story, which I think was a made-for-TV movie, but I'm not sure though. There was also another adaptation of this book in 2001 called Dagon, which was directed by Stuart Gordon, who actually did several H.P. Lovecraft adaptations. Now, the movie Dagon was based on this book, but it took its name from the story Dagon. Now, I've seen bits and pieces of the movie Dagon, but I haven't watched the whole thing, however. There was also another adaptation of this book in 2007 called Cthulhu. Now, not specifically this story, but H.P. Lovecraft's works in general have had a huge influence on pop culture, which is kind of funny when you stop to think about it, because when H.P. Lovecraft was alive, hardly anybody knew who he was. It really wasn't until after he died when H.P. Lovecraft's stories started getting the recognition that they deserved, but now his stories and his Cthulhu mythos have had a huge influence on pop culture. Like today you have video games which are based on the Cthulhu mythos. You even have other authors writing books that take place in the Cthulhu mythos. I know Robert Bloch, who wrote the book Psycho, has written a lot of books that take place in Lovecraft's mythology. And you definitely see the influence of Lovecraft on more modern-day writers like Clive Barker and Stephen King, and especially Alan Moore. Like, if you read some of Alan Moore's comics, like, you could tell that Alan Moore is definitely a huge H.P. Lovecraft fan, because you can definitely see an H.P. Lovecraft influence on Alan Moore's comic books. Alan Moore even wrote a graphic novel called Neonomicon, which is set in H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. And Alan Moore is currently coming out with the comic book series Providence, which is kind of a prequel to Neonomicon. Now, I've only read the first issue of Providence so far, but so far I am enjoying it. I definitely want to check out the other issues of that comic book series. You can even see influences of H.P. Lovecraft in the Alien franchise. Even the first season of True Detective was very Lovecraftian in a lot of ways, so Lovecraft has definitely had an influence on modern pop culture. But yeah, that was my review on The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft, and bye.